So let's go into the psychology of black and white. Now, what is it that when someone sees black and white, why does it make us feel the way it does? What is it that attracts us to it? So the language of black and white, and it really is a different language than color. So here's a quote from Britannica, and I'll just go ahead and read it. Language, a system of conventional spoken, manual, signed, or written symbols by means of which human beings as members of social group and participants in its culture express themselves. The functions of language include communication, the expression of identity, play, imaginative expression, and emotional release. And if you think about it, when we choose to use black and white as the language of our photography, it really is a language because it affects the participants in the culture of photography or the people who see images. It functions as a language that expresses the identity of us and the work that we're doing. It gives us that imaginative expression. It's been the primary language of photography since the beginning. Colors become a pretty strong contender, but I think people, when they think about photography, lots of times they think about black and white. At least people who are thinking about serious photography, they may not think that black and white is the only serious photography, but they think of black and white as part of the grounding of and the foundation of photography. A lot of times people are using black and white and they're shooting black and white. And what I find with most people is they're converting with black and white during post-production, which I do all the time. But we're not really thinking about using the complete language. We're just kind of getting in there and making a statement without really drilling down into the purpose of that statement. So we just have to remember that, when we take color out, it goes down to light, contrast, tone, highlight, shadow, shape, texture, those things which really are the vocabulary of this language. Those things are also part of the vocabulary of shooting in color, but they become much more important with the language of black and white. So black and white is unnatural. Some of that stuff I just showed you a minute ago on the awards, those photos, because they were black and white, cause us to see them a little bit differently and make us take a moment to interpret them and understand them. And in a way, we sort of use our imagination to fill in the color. So it leaves something to the viewer to experiment with and explore and have an experience, whereas color may not always work that way. It depends on the colors in your images. You can do the same thing with color when the colors are right and they're well used. Color can also, I mentioned it can be distracting before, and one of those distractions is emotional reactions, because colors mean things to different cultures. In my color class a few weeks ago, I talked about that. And like in the Western culture, when we see red, we think of danger. And so if I see red in a color, in a photo, that can have this unconscious effect on me. Whereas if I don't have the red, then, and it's just a gray, a person may not know that thing was red in reality, and they may not have that response to it. Same thing with yellow. It means caution. If I take the yellow out, like I did on those hoses a minute ago, it completely removes that subconscious reaction, because the viewer's not going to have that because they don't know that color was there. The other thing is that we have a different feeling for black and white because of the way it's been used in the past so much. I think I have a slide on this. Let's come over here. Yep, right here. So I just pulled up a bunch of historical images on this website. And these are all things that are from photojournalism or photojournalistic. And this is what we were used to up until maybe the 70s or 80s, when we started seeing more color used in press, like newspapers and magazines. But we were sort of taught, people who are my age or around it, sort of learned that black and white was the language of photography before we really even started working with color, because that's what we saw everywhere. So we were sort of introduced to it and even now you see still a certain amount of black and white used, but you don't really see it nearly as much in magazines and newspapers. It's become more of a creative decision rather than a decision for purpose. In the early days, the magazines and newspapers just didn't have the technology to do good color on newsprint or magazine paper. Once that came around, then a lot of newspapers switched over to color. I find it sort of distracting. I would rather see black and white many times on a newspaper, but that just isn't as common. It really depends. If it's a local paper, it depends on what part of the paper you're in. It's a timeless connection to the roots of photography. So for example, Edward Weston, some of the work that he did, which was considered groundbreaking at the time, let's get back over here, those are the things that a lot of us learned about photography when we were seeing them, like his pepper number 30 here. It's all about the shapes and the forms. And when people saw this at first, it just blew their minds, because it made them realize that photography can show things in ways that they never imagined. And he explored this idea. These are all Weston photos here, Edward Weston. He would just explore different subjects and show them. And of course, he was working in black and white at the time. That's all he had. But he didn't care about that, because it was about the shapes and the patterns and the light. And those are the things that he was exploring. Here, the direction of light picks up all those beautiful patterns and shapes in the sand. If this had been a overcast day, it wouldn't be a very interesting subject. But this one here, just it's close up of this door. This one has a little bit of a tint to it. So it's not a true black and white. I would call it a monotone. But it still works just fine, because it's all about the light and the texture. And then one more of the dunes. He did lots of dunes, and these are just beautiful. This is a case where, when I'm editing something, I rarely will let my shadows go that deep. But with black and white, when you're dealing with shapes and forms, you have license to sort of break those rules and let a shadow clip more than you might, or letting a highlight clip more than you might if it was color, because it becomes much more appealing as a shape when you sort of break the clipping rule. So, we have different emotions related to black and white, because part of it is we've sort of been trained to see black and white by famous photographers of the past, by the media around us, and that causes us to have different emotions when we see it. Black and white is also considered more artistic, and I've often thought this is sort of an interesting thing, and it's something that I pushed back against during the 80s, because I didn't really appreciate that, because I was doing a lot of color work at the time. And part of that is because black and white was never really considered a serious art by museums and galleries and collectors up until maybe the 80s, when it started being shown more in museums. But it took a long time for that to happen. And part of it was for various reasons. One of them was that the early color prints weren't very stable, and they would fade easily if exposed to light. And so collectors weren't interested in them, because if something starts fading, it loses value. And they didn't want something that they couldn't hang on to for a while and have it at least retain its value to them. Also, most amateurs were shooting in color. Most advertising and mass media was done in color. And because of that, it seemed like anything in color was really amateurish, or it was intended for advertising. It wasn't real photography. So a lot of people hung on to black and white because of that, because black and white was different than all that. It was considered an art form. The other thing is, a lot of artists, printing color was very difficult doing it yourself, setting up a color darkroom. I messed around a little bit with that at home, and it was a real pain, because color is very specific on temperatures. You have to be careful about it. There are more chemicals involved. Dark rooms, you can't have safe lights like you can, not the same kind of safe lights. All the color dark rooms I've worked at in color labs had no safe lights. So we had to work in complete darkness. And it was difficult to work with. There were a few people who were really good at it, like here in town, Christopher Burkett was doing the Cibachromes, and he became a Cibachrome master printer, to where he was doing these really beautiful color prints, but he was doing it all himself. And that was something not many people could do. For me, I was lucky that I worked in a photo lab. And so I had access to all the controls and the printing gear and everything. So that opened the door for me to work in color. But for many people who didn't have access to something like that, color just wasn't an option. And if you were a fine art photographer, if you wanted to make the print yourself, which is an important thing, I think, a lot of times for artists, then you pretty much had to work in black and white. A lot of photographers didn't like handing that process over to the color lab, because the color lab, the printers there, no matter how much communication you had with them, wouldn't always do something exactly the way you wanted it. They may not burn it the same way you wanted it or crop it exactly. And so you didn't have that kind of control. Fortunately, in today's world, you can have that control if you want it. Some people still have others do the printing for them, and that's okay as long as you're managing that printing and feel like you've got a good handle on the output, that it is what you wanted it to be. But one of the reasons, again, that black and white is considered more artistic is because the artist had control of the process from start to finish, rather than having somebody else doing the last bit, which was the printing. So black and white, it really transcends reality. It gives us the opportunity to see the world in a way that we don't normally see it. And really, that's the beautiful thing about photography. To me, it's the beautiful thing about all visual arts. It changes the way you see the world around you. When I first got into photography and I started making images, I got so enthralled by it that, and I'm sure this has happened to everybody here, that I would be somewhere and I would look at a scene and I would see this beautiful light. I wouldn't have my camera, but I would see it as though I was going to photograph it. It made me start noticing things that I hadn't noticed before. And that's a really important thing. So shooting black and white makes me go deeper with that noticing. It makes me think about what would that look like in black and white. It's like when I started shooting HDR, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, and I was using that process quite a bit. I got to the point where I could look at a scene and I can imagine in my mind what it would look like after I was done shooting and processing it. And the same thing goes with black and white. Once you've trained that part of your brain to really think and see in black and white, you can look at a color scene and really understand what it would look like in black and white and maybe ignore some of the colors. So that's what I'm saying, to be intentional about your black and white sometimes. It's absolutely okay to make that decision in post-production to switch over to black and white, but I want to encourage people to maybe shoot in black and white, either with black and white film, which has gotten quite expensive lately, or on a digital camera shooting in your monotone setting so that you're capturing in black and white. And I'm encouraging people to do that with raw files.